July 2nd, 2008. Early in the morning, the sun has barely risen over the small city of Rio Brilhante in Brazil. The streets are still empty, save for a few early risers starting their day. One such early riser walks along a narrow road in the city centre when he glances into a nearby vacant lot and sees something strange among scattered rubbish and weeds. Lying motionless in the dirt is the body of a man. His arms are stretched out wide, his legs crossed neatly at the ankles. The shape is unmistakable, a crucifixion. Shirtless, the letters INRI have been crudely carved into the man's flesh, just above his sternum, a Latin acronym meaning Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Whatever had happened here, it clearly wasn't random. This wasn't some street robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely. Police arrive quickly at the scene as a crowd begins to gather, including journalists from the town's local newspapers and TV stations. Because in a city of less than 40,000 people, this sort of thing just didn't happen. It doesn't take long for the body to be identified as 33-year-old bricklayer Catalino Gardina. Examining his body, police determined that he had been suffocated with a plastic bag and stabbed once in the heart with a knife, possibly the same one used to carve the letters into his chest. The deliberate staging of the body makes it clear that this is not a typical murder scene. It feels ritualistic, sacrificial even. But beyond these disturbing signs, there's little forensic evidence at the scene. There's no obvious murder weapon that's been left, no fingerprints are found, no clear footprints are discovered, and they can't even determine if Catalino was killed there or brought there afterwards by his killer. All they can say for certain is that his killer had very purposefully and very deliberately posed his body in the shape of a cross. But whether it was intended to mean something religious, something ritualistic, or something else entirely is unclear. So police begin canvassing the area, as well as Catalino's neighbours, looking for anyone who might have heard or seen something suspicious the night before. But nobody had. As they dig into Catalino's background, they find little that could point to a motive. He was a quiet man, described as humble by his friends and family. He was openly gay, and he was said to have struggled with alcoholism and even drug abuse in the past. And while nobody knows it at the time, these particular traits would be vital to understanding why he was attacked and what had happened to him that night. So with no leads at all and no answers from the police, the media begins to fill the vacuum with speculation. While some newspapers and TV reports feature concerned locals describing how they're too afraid to leave their homes after dark, others begin to speculate about the meaning behind the symbolic pose and writing, hinting at the possibility of something darker at work. A religious fanatic, a satanic cult, or even something supernatural. And with every headline, the fear and panic in the small city only intensifies. While the police try to downplay it to keep the public calm, even they begin to suspect that this is not going to be an isolated incident. It feels purposeful to them, the work of somebody extremely disturbed, and they can't help but wonder if Catalino's murder might just be the start of something, rather than the end. And they were right, at least about that aspect, because Catalino was the first victim of a ritualistic serial killer, and it wouldn't be long before more bodies would be found in the quiet city of Rio Brilhante, each carefully positioned in the shape of a cross. And yet, even as panic spread and rumours of a serial killer took hold, no one could have imagined the truth. That behind it all was a 16-year-old boy. Driven by a twisted sense of morality, determined to purify the town by hunting those he deemed immoral, he would soon come to be known as Maniaco da Cruz, or in English, the Cross Maniac. Before we carry on with the video, I just wanted to flag up front that this case has received little attention outside of Brazil, and as a result, many of the sources used to write this script have been translated into English, which could lead to some details being incorrect or lost in translation. I've done my best to verify everything, but it just feels inevitable in these sorts of scenarios that I'll make some mistakes. I just thought it was worth saying before we jump back into the case. The following month, on August 24th, a second body was found in Rio Brilhante. This time, a woman was discovered lying on her back on top of a grave in the São Cristóvão cemetery. Just like Catalino, her arms were fully extended to either side, with her palms facing upwards and her legs crossed at the ankles, making the recognizable crucifixion pose. She was completely naked, and her neck bore clear signs of pressure, bruising, redness, and swelling, indicating she had likely been strangled. She was quickly identified as 22-year-old Leticia Neves de Oliveira, a gas station attendant who had failed to return home after finishing her shift the previous evening. Tragically, her family had reported her missing just hours before her body was discovered. Just like with Catalino's crime scene, the investigators found no signs indicating a struggle had occurred in the area. So this meant that not only had her body been placed there with caution, but that her killer had been extremely careful and precise when arranging her limbs into the cross pose. Leticia didn't even appear to have any defensive wounds visible, leading them to suspect she was either taken by surprise or had been unconscious when she was killed. There was nothing carved into her skin, like there had been with Catalino, though several sources claim a small cross necklace was placed around her neck, but I couldn't verify that detail. Despite being found naked, tests showed no evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. Her friends and co-workers told the police she had no known enemies. She was quiet and hard-working, lived with her family, and had no criminal record. Unlike Catalino, she didn't use drugs, and she wasn't a heavy drinker, and as far as they could tell, she had no other connection with him. But they knew there had to be a reason the killer had chosen these two individuals. Nobody would create such carefully staged scenes using random victims. Would they? Interestingly, they did discover that Leticia was also gay. Given the religious symbolism, this led to speculation that, perhaps rather than a cult or satanic motive as initially theorized, their suspect could be motivated by religion, murdering those he saw as morally flawed and sinful. Even though the locals immediately linked the two cases for obvious reasons, the police refused to publicly confirm any connection between them, wanting to prevent mass panic. Despite their attempts to maintain calm and order, with this second victim found posed in the shape of a cross, it wasn't just local news who began covering the case, it became a national story. And as mass panic and fear overtook Brazil, that's when the nickname began to take hold. The Maniac of the Cross. People were so afraid that nighttime curfews were followed by just about everyone in the city, despite not being legally enforced. Local downtown shops were reported to be practically empty after dark, and that was if they stayed open at all. Some schools even shortened their hours so kids could get home earlier, especially after a large number of parents began refusing to let their children walk home alone, regardless of the time of day. Some local religious leaders also began using the cases as fuel for their sermons, preaching about morality and punishment, further fanning the flames of paranoia in the largely religious community, whether intentionally or not. And then a third body was found, and this time the victim was a child. On October 3rd, 13-year-old Glyce Kelly da Silva left her school and never made it home. She was last seen walking alone in a quiet residential area of Rio Brilhante, wearing her school uniform and carrying a small shoulder bag. By the evening, with no sign of her, her family reported her missing to the police. Their friends and neighbours helped search for her, combing the streets, knocking on doors, and calling out her name. Because of the two recent murders, everyone feared the worst, but no one wanted to believe it could happen again, not to a child. But tragically, 2 days later, their worst fears were confirmed. In an unfinished, half-abandoned construction site on the outskirts of town, Glyce's body was discovered. She was lying on her back, stretched out across a slab of concrete surrounded by broken beams and discarded bricks. Once again, she had been posed like a cross, with her arms extended fully to either side and her legs crossed precisely at the ankles. But this time, the killer had left something else at the scene, a message. Beside her body, police discovered a handwritten note, which reportedly read, "Corpse of Thor" in English, alongside the phrase, "Until next hell," or potentially, "Until next winter." Strangely, almost every article or source I looked at had a different explanation of the contents of this note, some featuring completely new elements, and others featuring differing combinations. For example, some accounts claim the note was covered in hand-drawn crosses and random letters that seemed to spell out the word hell in places. So while I can confirm there was a note, its exact contents are a little unclear. Like the first two victims, Glyce's cause of death was found to be asphyxiation, likely by strangulation. Once again, there was no sign of sexual assault, she had no defensive wounds on her body, and the crime scene offered no real forensic evidence. And like the other two cases, there were no witnesses, and there was no surveillance footage. It now seemed glaringly obvious that the killer was selecting his crime scenes carefully. They were all quiet, open-air locations, with few natural observers. Any attempts to suppress rumours of a serial killer or satanic cult now fell on deaf ears. The story had already put fear into the hearts of the nation, especially the residents of Rio Brilhante. But with the third victim being a 13-year-old child, this was ramped up to 11. Rumours about satanic rituals, religious fanatics, and supernatural curses spread like wildfire. Residents gathered in churches to pray, light candles, and plead for protection. With mounting pressure to find the killer, a special task force was formed to handle the case, pulling in resources from Campo Grande and other nearby jurisdictions. While the authorities had thought they might be onto something with their theory that the killer was a religious fanatic of some kind, punishing those he judged as morally lacking, they struggled to understand how 13-year-old Gleiss could fit into this pattern. The only connection between the first two victims was that they were both gay, so they had speculated, given the religious imagery, that the killer was targeting and punishing people he believed were sinful. But this idea seemed to fall apart with the murder of Gleiss. Whatever the motive, the Cross Maniac had made his boldest move yet, and by taking the life of a child, he had confirmed what many in Rio Brillante had feared from the beginning. This wasn't a spree, it wasn't impulsive, it was purposeful, ritualistic, and likely going to keep happening until the person responsible was stopped. When police finally admitted that the three cases were connected and that they were hunting a serial killer, something unexpected happened. A witness came forward. A 17-year-old girl known only as Carla walked into a police station and told them that something terrifying had happened to her around a week before Gleiss was murdered. She told them she had gone to a concert in town that night. Afterwards, she was waiting near a phone booth for a relative to pick her up when a man in a hoodie approached her. Although he initially didn't say anything, he suddenly pulled out a knife and pressed it against her stomach. He then ordered her to walk with him, leading her to an abandoned building on the edge of town, and once alone, he began to interrogate her. He asked her if she believed in God, if she was a virgin, if she liked men or women, how many boyfriends she'd had, and then, perhaps most chillingly, he asked her if she thought someone could ever love him. She replied carefully and kindly, trying not to provoke him. He then told her, "I went out tonight to kill a whore, and found you instead." And then he let her go, but not before warning her that if she told anyone about what happened, he would come back to kill not only her, but her entire family too. But after seeing a 13-year-old girl had been the next victim, she felt she had no choice but to come forward, in case her attacker was the serial killer they were hunting, and her account could somehow help catch him. However, she never actually saw the man's face, at least not clearly. It was too dark and he never removed his hood, so all she could say for certain was that he sounded like he was a teenager, likely somewhere between 17 and 20. So even though her account perhaps helped them understand how the Cross Maniac was selecting his victims, judging them based on their answers to his questions, it didn't bring them any closer to identifying who he was. Friends, family and neighbours of Gleiss posted tributes online, many of them on Orkut, a social media site popular in Brazil at the time. On Orkut, users had what was called a scrapbook, a sort of public wall similar to a Facebook wall back then, where other people could leave public messages referred to as scraps. The task force monitored all the activity on Gleiss's page, hoping to spot something unusual or suspicious, and that's when they saw a strange message posted beneath one of the tributes on her scrapbook. Written in all capitals, it read, "Dead people don't get scraps, you sickos." The comment was clearly mocking the act of leaving tributes on the dead child's page, and while it could have been the cruel act of some internet troll, it wasn't. The message had been made by a user calling themselves DogHell666. The Orkut profile featured images of disturbing drawings, alongside a teenager dressed all in black, with dark eyeliner and painted nails. In a large portion of the photos, he was posing among various gravestones in the dark. The user had joined a range of troubling groups with names such as I Love Corpses and I'm a Satanist. But in reality, he in no way resembled the profile they had for their killer, who they believed to be experienced, precise, and methodical, not an attention-seeking kid. But when the records from Gleiss's phone came back, they revealed she had missed around a dozen calls right after her estimated time of death. And although the number was not directly tied to anyone, the exact same number was publicly listed in the bio of the Dog Hell profile as belonging to them. Whoever owned that page, whoever the teenage boy in the pictures was now seen as their prime suspect. And it didn't take long for the task force to trace the page's owner to a 16-year-old boy who not only lived in Rio Brillante, but he was actually the neighbour of the first victim, Catalino Gardena. In fact, they had even spoken to him as a potential witness the day after Catalino's body was found, asking if he or his mother had seen or heard anything unusual. His name was Dyonathan Celestrino, and despite being only 16 years old, he was the serial killer they had been hunting. Born on January 5, 1992 in Rio Brillante, Dyonathan was raised by his mother, who was a public school teacher, and his aunt. There doesn't appear to be any information on who his father was, or if Dyonathan himself even knew his identity. Although he grew up with little money, by all available accounts his upbringing didn't involve any obvious trauma. There were no records of abuse, no known violent incidents, and he had no criminal history. At school, his teachers described him as quiet and withdrawn, but not disruptive or problematic. He wasn't bullied or tormented by his peers, though he didn't have many friends either, choosing to keep mostly to himself. As a teenager, his interests began to stand out. He dressed entirely black, wore heavy makeup, and listened to metal music. In such a small religious community, he was seen as an outsider, but nobody believed him to be dangerous. That said, he did have a difficult personality and was viewed as being unpredictable. He was known to be moody and to snap at people over the tiniest of things, such as asking him a basic question. Eerily, one of his favourite things to do was to hang out in local cemeteries by himself, and even when the killings began, he continued going out late at night and aimlessly wandering through these graveyards. His mother didn't suspect a thing, and never once asked where he was going. With no real friends, he spent hours locked in his bedroom, on the internet, particularly on Orkut, where he frequently posted in dark and disturbing communities about death, Satanism, and the occult. His mother wasn't allowed to enter his bedroom and had no idea what dark secrets he was hiding inside. But on October 9th, less than a week after Gleiss's body had been discovered, police arrived at his home with a search warrant. He was arrested and taken into custody without resistance, remaining completely silent when officers read him his rights. With Dyonathan out of the way, for the first time ever, his bedroom door was opened to somebody other than himself. Inside, the officers were immediately struck by an imposing image on the wall, a large photograph of a man they all instantly knew and recognized, Francisco de Assis Pereira. Better known as the Park Maniac, Pereira was one of Brazil's most infamous serial killers, having assaulted and murdered at least 11 women in São Paulo in the late 1990s. His crimes were brutal, methodical, and carried out under the pretense of religious and moral authority. For most, he was a figure of horror. But in Dyonathan's bedroom, he was pinned up on the wall the way a teenager would typically place a poster of their favourite actor or musician. There were scribbled note pages everywhere, featuring satanic poetry and occult writings. One note even had a list of names, with either the word dead or saved written next to each of them. They located dozens of newspaper clippings about the Cross Maniac in the room, and they shockingly even found several knives, which still had traces of blood on them. And as if all of that wasn't damning enough, they found items stolen from the 3 victims scattered around the room, including jewellery that belonged to Leticia and the blouse Gleiss had been wearing when she was killed. There was now no question at all that this 16-year-old boy was the Cross Maniac. But what they didn't yet understand was why he had committed the murders and what the meaning of the symbolic crucifixion pose was to him. Once in custody, it didn't take long for Dyonathan to confess. He told the detectives that he did not believe in God, but that he did believe in Satan, which doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, as they're sort of a package deal. You could argue he was an atheistic Satanist, but that doesn't actually line up with his other statements either. He said that he forced his victims to go with him to isolated locations at knife point, where he would ask them a number of questions, deciding their fate based on the answers they gave him. If he deemed them to be impure in his eyes, he would kill them. But really, when it came down to it, his main explanation for why he killed all 3 of his victims was the same. He claimed they were all homosexual. This was true of Catalino and Leticia, though it's unclear if it was true of 13-year-old Gleiss. Supposedly, the crucifixion pose was to help their souls ascend into heaven, as if he was redeeming them somehow by murdering them and posing their bodies. Though if he didn't believe in God, I don't really understand how he could believe in heaven. With so much contradiction and confusion in his statements, it's difficult to make sense of what actually motivated his actions, especially given that he also confessed that he was obsessed with the Park Maniac and that one of his main goals had been to surpass his idol's body count. He told them he looked up to Pereira, that he'd studied his case and all of his murders, and in doing so he made it very clear that he hadn't acted impulsively. He had been careful, precise, methodical, and that's what made him even more dangerous, because this wasn't about rage. It was about control. He believed he was right, and worse, he believed he was necessary. In his eyes, his murders were moral and justified. He was punishing people who were impure. That same day, a press conference was held announcing the apprehension of the Cross Maniac. The revelation that a 16-year-old teenager was behind the murders shocked not just the residents of the city of Rio Brilhante, but the entire nation of Brazil. Despite the damning evidence, it just didn't seem believable to many of the locals, and so there was immediate speculation that Dyonathan had not acted alone. The belief that he had been leading a cult of satanic teenagers became widespread, so much so that the police had to formally declare that he had acted entirely alone. though this did little to stop the whispers of a murderous cult still lurking in the shadows, who were even more dangerous now their head had been severed. Psychiatric evaluations of Dyonathan determined that he was mentally competent, even though he displayed a number of disturbing traits. He was emotionally cold, unpredictable, and showed no signs of empathy or remorse. As a result, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and chronic psychopathy. One of the psychologists even claimed that his religious motive was completely made up, and that he actually killed because he enjoyed the sense of control and power he felt from making other people suffer. In their final report, the evaluators stated that Dyonathan presented a high risk of future violence and posed an ongoing danger to society. But because he was still a minor, Brazilian law significantly limited his potential punishment. No matter how horrific his crimes were, he could only be held until he was 21 under the Child and Adolescent Statute, which meant that he could only receive a 5-year sentence for the murders of 3 people. Although the authorities tried to have him institutionalized as a way to get around this limitation, every psychiatric hospital they spoke to refused to accept him as a patient. So he was sent to a juvenile correctional facility in Ponta Porã, nearly 200 kilometers from his hometown, to be held until he turned 21. There he kept mostly to himself, with staff finding him polite and respectful. They reported that he got good grades in his classes, and even turned in some of the best assignments in his group. But in 2013, he turned 21. And as a result, his sentence was officially over, which meant legally there were no grounds to keep him detained, and he had to be released back into the world. But the deadline for his release came and passed, and nothing changed, with authorities keeping Dyonathan behind bars. Despite his apparent good behavior throughout his time in prison, continuous psychiatric evaluations classified him as psychologically unstable, manipulative, and unrepentant. They all made it clear he continued to pose a threat to the public and was extremely likely to reoffend and even murder again if he was let free. Though no official new sentence was given to him, a judge decided that he posed too great a risk to be released, and as a result, he would remain behind bars. There was no set release date and no planned end to his incarceration, so in essence, he was going to remain in prison indefinitely. As you can probably imagine, Dyonathan wasn't too happy with this ruling. He believed he'd served his time and that legally he should be set free. So he took matters into his own hands. Although there were plans to move him to a more secure facility, Dyonathan was still being held in the Ponta Porã Juvenile Centre, and it was significantly lacking in security measures. Taking advantage of this, Dyonathan somehow got hold of a saw of some kind, though the details are a little unclear. He may have had it smuggled into the prison, or perhaps fashioned it out of materials he acquired somehow. He then used it to quietly cut through the metal bars over the window in his room, allowing him to slip through it and escape on March 3, 2013. No guards saw him go. There were no alarms, no chase. By the time anyone even noticed he was missing, he was already long gone. The next morning, the news that the Cross Maniac had escaped spread fast, with national media outlets running the story within hours, and the public being immediately put on alert. His images were plastered all over the news, with the public being asked to report any potential sightings of him. Tip lines were instantly flooded with calls, with people claiming to see him all around the country as mass panic overtook Brazil. There was still a genuine belief that Dyonathan was the leader of some sort of satanic cult, and that he was going to reunite with them now that he was out, and not only continue his murder spree, but escalate it to make up for lost time. A number of social media profiles appeared online, which claimed to be Dyonathan himself, featuring posts where he threatened to kill again, this time in different cities across the country. Although all these profiles were later found to be fake by the police, the impact they had on the public was very real. The detention center he escaped from wasn't far from the border of Paraguay, so Brazilian police reached out to their Paraguayan counterparts, telling them there was a high chance a dangerous serial killer had crossed the border into their country. And they were totally right, because on April 27th, almost 2 months since his escape, a Brazilian expat in the Paraguayan city of Horqueta informed the police that he had seen Dyonathan on the street, recognizing his face. Following up on his tip, Dyonathan was discovered to be living in a nearby boarding house. There, he had been leading a surprisingly low-key life, working at a car wash, learning to speak Spanish, and even dating a local woman. But inside his room, police allegedly found notebooks filled with disturbing drawings and chilling phrases such as, "All Catholics must die," and "Alive or dead, I'm a serial killer." There are even claims that his phone contained messages showing he'd been planning to meet up with a 14-year-old boy the week he was arrested, implying he had intended to murder him. Whether he killed anyone else during his 2 months of freedom is unknown. Though if he did, he clearly didn't pose them in the same crucifixion style he had become notorious for, Otherwise, I imagine it would have been all over the news. After his discovery, he was arrested and taken into custody by Paraguayan police, where he instantly confessed that he was the notorious maniac of the Cross. They discovered that his room in the boarding house had been paid for by his mother and his aunt, and that they had regularly visited him there, meaning they had been knowingly aiding a violent fugitive. I would have thought that would be enough for them to be legally punished in some manner themselves, but I couldn't find anything claiming that was the case. Dyonathan even gave an interview on a local radio station after his arrest, where he claimed that he was actually a hitman and not a serial killer, despite the claim contradicting all the evidence and his own prior confessions. Regardless, 2 days after his arrest, on April 29th, he was extradited back to Brazil. The Cross Maniac was back in their custody, but the question of what exactly they were meant to do with him still remained unanswered. While authorities tried to figure out what to do with him, with more than 20 psychiatric facilities refusing to admit him as a patient, he was almost killed in custody when a police officer fired a shot at him in his cell, grazing his face. The officer later claimed his gun had fired by accident, but other witnesses claimed he had been threatening Dyonathan for days and had pointed his gun at him multiple times. Eventually, he was admitted to the psychiatric wing of the Campo Grande Penal Institution, a secure unit in a maximum security prison where he could receive treatment for his mental illnesses. However, he didn't fade quietly back into the prison system. While he was previously seen as a model inmate, after being recaptured, his imprisonment was marked by repeated violence, erratic behaviour, and clashes with prison staff and other inmates. For example, in 2015, he attacked a prison guard with a sharpened broomstick, and the following year he tried to stab another staff member with a fork. In one of the most serious incidents, in September 2023, he assaulted a prison officer, punching him in the face and threatening to kill him, all because he didn't want to go back to his cell following his recreational time. Even when he was restricted to only having solitary yard time, he continued to cause trouble. In October, he threw a bottle of urine at a guard, something reports claim he had done multiple times, after once again being asked to return to his cell. As a result of all this, he is never left unsupervised in any situation, and is seen as a serious risk to those inside the prison, let alone the public outside. In 2024, Brazil's custodial hospitals were all ordered to be closed, meaning there would no longer be any form of psychiatric detention available in the country. These institutions were realistically the only places equipped to manage mentally ill offenders like Dyonathan. With their closures, he was moved out of psychiatric care and into a secure wing of the prison with the general population. Now in his mid-30s, Dyonathan remains behind bars, spending most of his time in isolation for the safety of the staff and the other inmates. And there are no signs that his mental illness or his violent behaviour have improved. Interestingly, his detention has never actually been legally defined. There has been no trial, no sentence, and there is no clear legal path forward. So while he could technically remain incarcerated until the day he dies, he could also technically be released at any point if a judge ordered him to be. And that's where the case sits today, with Dyonathan in a sort of legal limbo inside a locked cell in a maximum security prison, with no sentence and no end date, just a locked door, and the uneasy hope from the residents of Rio Brilhante that it stays shut. And with that, our exploration of Brazil's Cross Maniac killer comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and comment and all that sort of stuff that helps feed the appetite of the ever-hungry algorithm gods, so other people actually get a chance to watch the video, or the chance to ignore it. Either way, all that sort of stuff helps put it in front of people, so it gets the opportunity to live or die on its own 2 feet. As I said up front, a lot of the information about this case hasn't come from English language sources, so there's a high likelihood that some of the details will be wrong or mistranslated, but I've tried my best to be as accurate as possible with the information presented. If any of you happen to be Brazilian and know more about the case or want to correct anything I've said, then just let me know down below. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and checking out some of my other true crime content. If you want to support my channel further and to have your name at the end of my videos, I've got a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon in the description too. Until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. June 2nd, 1998. Wuhan, one of China's largest cities, is winding down for the night. The crowds have thinned, the streets are quiet, and the heat still clings to the air like a second skin. It's just before 11 p.m, and in the Wuchang district, the only sounds are the occasional rattle of a bicycle or the dull hum of distant traffic. And beneath the glow of the street lamps, a woman walks alone. Her name is Xiao Chen, and she's just finished a shift at the new internship she started, hopeful that she'll have a proper job waiting for her there once she graduates. She gets closer and closer to the safety of her home, completely unaware that a man has been following her the entire time. When he reaches her, he pulls out a knife and tells her not to scream. But overwhelmed by shock and fear at the sight of the blade, Xiao can't help herself, and so she screams at the top of her lungs. And although she couldn't have known it at the time, in doing so, she's just sealed her own fate, because the man had only intended to rob her. But upon hearing her scream, it sends something running through his body. Something he'll later describe as a mix of fear and excitement, an urge, a kind of rage he'll say he can't explain. Overtaken by this sudden rush, the man drags her into an alley and assaults her, and as she continues screaming, he finds himself completely overtaken by his urges, and he plunges the knife into her. Once, twice, 3 times. The more she screams, the more excited he gets. The more he feels the rush, the more he stabs her. By the time she stops moving, he stabbed her 38 times. Her chest and back are torn apart, and her internal organs are destroyed. Afterwards, covered in blood and unsure what to do, the man runs back to his motel in the darkness, where he washes himself clean. When police arrive at the scene, they find no suspect, no witnesses, and no clear motive. Just a scene so brutal that a young police trainee vomits the second he sees Xiao's body, later describing her back as resembling a beehive. With next to no forensic evidence found, it isn't long before the case starts to turn cold. And for a while, it just seems like a one-off. A horror without explanation. But this was only the beginning. Because roughly 1 year later, the man responsible would re-emerge from the shadows to begin one of the most disturbing murder sprees in the country's history. From 1999 until he was finally caught in 2001, many more women would be stabbed, assaulted, and even mutilated, with at least 13 of them being killed by the monster responsible. With the attacks spread across 2 provinces and no clear pattern, all investigators knew for certain was that their serial killer was targeting women who were alone, almost always in the hours before dawn. And for a long time, the killer remained a phantom. Although nobody knew his name, a rumor began to claim that almost all of his victims were wearing red when they were attacked. So the public soon gave him a new one. This is the story of the Red Dress Killer. Before we get back into the story, I just want to take a quick moment to say up front that a lot of the information used to write this script has come from non-English sources. For some reason, I had it in my head that this was a really famous case before I started going into it properly, but from what I could see, it has next to no coverage outside of China, beyond a few vague details and a short article in the Times. Even the English language books I found that mentioned the case didn't spend more than a page or 2 on it. So to find all the specifics, I've pretty much had to exclusively use Chinese sources that have been translated into English. As usual, this means there's a high likelihood of me making some mistakes and getting some of the information wrong. If any of you know what high-profile case I might have been confusing this one with, let me know down below. But anyway, when I started looking into this one, I thought it was an interesting case to cover, even if it wasn't whatever I actually had in my mind. And while I've got you, don't forget to like the video early to help it out in the algorithm. And if you're new to the channel and find the case interesting, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other true crime content. With all that said then, let's get back to the story. The mid-sized city of Yueyang in southern China rarely made the news. With the Yangtze River running along its edge and factories dotting the skyline, the city was best known for its barges and cranes, not for violence. But in the spring of 1999, something quietly shifted. It started on April 4th, when a young woman was attacked just before dawn. Her name was Yan Sanying, and she was a 31-year-old factory worker employed by the Yueyang Water Transport Company. Living close to her workplace, she left home around 5 a.m. that morning to begin her shift. As she walked alone along Yunxiang Lane, near the city's General Trade Union building, a man began following her. Only a few minutes from her front door, he attacked her. Without warning, without saying a word, he lunged at her with his knife. And as she screamed, his excitement only grew, causing him to stab her over and over again. And by the time he was finished, he'd stabbed her 16 times. When police arrived at the scene, they found her body lying in a pool of blood. There were no witnesses, and there were no signs of sexual assault. At first, the investigators considered the possibility of a robbery gone wrong, but nothing appeared to have been stolen from her. So they then began looking into potential disputes or conflicts she might have had in her life. But they didn't find any, and with so little evidence, the case stalled. Occurring a year later in a different city, they had no reason to connect Yan's murder to the 1998 killing of Xiao. Although on paper the two cases had a lot of similarities, it never occurred to anyone involved that the attacks were anything other than one-off senseless murders. In fact, it's unlikely anyone involved in Yan's case even knew about Xiao's murder. But over the following months, 2 more women were murdered in eerily similar circumstances in the city of Yueyang. While the specific details about who they were, and exactly how and where in the city they were killed, seem impossible to find, the basic facts are clear. All 3 victims were women. All of them were alone when they were killed. All were stabbed repeatedly, and all of the attacks occurred before dawn. In all 3 cases, there was no clear motive, just a sudden, overwhelming burst of violence. From what I can tell, despite now having 3 similar murders in the same city in the same year, the police never publicly acknowledged that a pattern might be forming. Each case was treated in isolation. Investigators followed standard procedure, but there were no warnings issued, and there was no effort to inform the public. And part of that may have come down to how crime was, and still is, reported in China. Newspapers there typically don't cover violent crimes unless the suspect has already been caught. So in 1999, the people of Yueyang had no idea what was happening. There were no headlines, and most residents hadn't even heard about the murders, not until years later. But inside the investigation, a few detectives were starting to worry. At least, that's what they said in hindsight. They claimed that the attacks didn't seem random. Not really. That even then, they felt there was method behind the violence. A focus on women walking alone, always attacked with a knife, with nothing stolen and no clear motive. Almost as if the killer didn't want anything from them, other than the act itself. Looking back now, it's easy to see why the problem was only going to get worse, because China, at that time, was undergoing a massive transformation. For decades under Chairman Mao, life had been tightly controlled. Every adult belonged to a work unit. Neighborhood committees monitored everything from your mail to your dinner guests. It was a system so restrictive that even bicycle theft seemed risky. But by the late 1990s, that world was fading. People were moving freely between cities and provinces. Surveillance was looser. Society was changing fast. And for the first time, it was possible to be anonymous. Especially in industrial cities like Yueyang, where migrants were coming and going, and where a stranger could blend in without raising any red flags. Whatever the case, by the end of the year, 3 women were dead, and the man responsible had learned the most important lesson of all. That in this new China, it was possible to kill and simply vanish. And while the brutality of the killings should have sparked fear, Yueyang remained largely quiet. There were whispers, of course, of women found stabbed in the dark, of strange men seen lingering near factory dormitories and alleyways, but the panic hadn't set in yet. That would come later. Because in the year that followed, the murders wouldn't just continue. They'd escalate. Although no other lives were claimed in 1999 by the killer, there are multiple reports of attacks and attempted attacks, though the exact timeline of these crimes is a little unclear. It wasn't until February 2000 that he claimed the life of his next victim. And when he struck again, the violence wasn't just as bad as before, it was worse. On February 13th, around 4:30 in the morning, a 33-year-old woman called Zhong left her home as usual. She worked at the Yueyang Petroleum Company and was known to suffer from a mental illness of some kind. Before she could get far, she was forced at knife point into a nearby stairwell inside the Zhangyun Transport Dormitory Complex. There, the killer stabbed her 25 times, and when it was over, he mutilated her body, slicing off her right nipple. Then he stole what little money she had on her, less than 10 yuan. Just 10 days later, he killed again. On the morning of February 23rd, a 47-year-old woman named Li was out jogging near her home as part of her usual daily routine. But that morning, the killer was waiting. He pounced without warning, lunging out from a side path and grabbing her by the throat with both hands. As he choked her, he demanded all her valuables. She handed over what little cash she had on her, and the moment he let go to pocket the money, she took her chance and ran. Enraged that his victim was trying to escape, he pulled out his knife and gave chase. When he caught up with her, he stabbed her over and over with a level of violence that had now become his signature, 25 times in total. And when she was dead, he simply walked away. He returned to the small motel where he was staying, washed the blood from his hands, and went to sleep as if nothing had happened. With 5 brutal and eerily similar murders of women in the span of a year, it had become impossible for the Yueyang police to keep viewing them as unrelated incidents. And by then, it wasn't just the police who were noticing the pattern. The public was catching on too, especially after one chilling detail came to light. Lee had been wearing red when she was killed. Suddenly, a rumor swept through the city and quickly spread to surrounding areas that a deranged killer was targeting women who wore red clothing or had long hair. Within weeks, women were cutting their hair short, hiding their red garments, and avoiding the streets after dark. And that's when his nickname was born, the Red Dress Killer. Then, on June 12th, once again at 4:30 in the morning, a 34-year-old woman was walking through a quiet area of the city when she was ambushed. As she screamed out and tried to fight back, the Red Dress Killer stabbed her 6 times before fleeing, perhaps being interrupted by a passerby. As a result, she wasn't dead when he left her lying in the street. She was rushed to hospital, but unfortunately, before she could provide the police with any useful information about her attacker, she died from her injuries. The following month, on July 22nd, another life was claimed. The victim was a cafeteria worker at the Yueyang train station called Li. That night, she'd stayed out late playing mahjong with her co-workers. At around 2 a.m., she left to walk home alone. While she was likely aware of the rumors of the Red Dress Killer at this point, her home was less than 100 meters away. But even with such a small journey, she never made it. Just before reaching her apartment, the killer attacked her, stabbing her to death and stealing 2,000 yuan in cash before running off into the night. With 7 murders in just over a year in such a small city, regardless of whether the newspapers were discussing the case or not, everyone now knew about it. And everyone was terrified. Facing immense pressure, the Yueyang Public Security Bureau assembled a special task force to hunt down and catch the man responsible, utilizing hundreds of police officers. They even brought in top experts from the Ministry of Public Security, including veteran criminal profiler Zhang Xin. As well as the 7 murder victims, there were many others who had been attacked and survived. Supposedly, if they didn't resist or scream when he demanded their belongings, he tended to let them go. And this allowed the task force to develop a composite sketch of their suspect. The party secretary of Yueyang, Yu Laishan, took personal control of the case, coordinating a public reward of 200,000 yuan for any information leading to the arrest of the Red Dress Killer. By the end of the year, despite the overwhelming attention now focused on the case from both the police and the public, no meaningful breakthroughs had been made, and the task force was no closer to unmasking the Red Dress Killer. In January or early February 2001, he claimed his 8th victim, though I wasn't able to find out anything about that case at all. And then, in the early hours of February 16th, he struck again. This time, it was in the Willipai area of Yueyanglu district, not far from the city centre. A woman in her early 30s was returning home after a late-night game of mahjong, carrying her purse and her mobile phone. She actually made it all the way back to her apartment and was in the process of climbing the steps to her front door when the killer made his move. As she reached the top of the stairs, he lunged. With his left hand, he covered her mouth and nose. With his right, he pressed a knife into her back and told her to hand over everything she had. She did as she was ordered, giving him roughly 4,000 yuan in cash as well as her phone. She didn't resist. She didn't scream. She did exactly what he asked her to, but that didn't save her. He stabbed her anyway, over and over. Then he vanished into the night like he always did. Except this time, he'd made a mistake. Because while the police had very little to go on in the earlier murders, this time they had a lead: the stolen mobile phone. Using new investigative tools, police began tracking the device, and the signal ultimately led them to a man named Duan Guocheng. It's not clear exactly how that identification happened. Duan already had a substantial criminal record, so it's possible they traced the phone's location and cross-checked for known offenders in the area. Or maybe it was more direct. In China, all SIM cards are registered to a person's real name and ID number. So if Duan had inserted his own SIM into the victim's phone, the authorities would have known who he was the moment it connected to the network. Duan was a 29-year-old local man from Yueyang who had spent most of his life in detention centers and prisons for theft and robbery. With a potential name and face to the phantom who had haunted the city for nearly 2 years, police moved quickly. Immediately after identifying him, 6 officers arrived at the modest 3-room apartment in Yueyang, where Duan lived with his parents. Duan's mother, Hu Yunxiang, begged them to tell her what was going on as they entered the apartment, but the officers refused to tell her anything. They just sat quietly under the family's faded poster of Chairman Mao and waited. As they hoped, just before dawn, Duan returned to the apartment. But before he entered the house, he spotted the police officers through the window and ran. They chased him through nearby alleys and into a local vegetable market. But Duan knew these streets like the back of his hand, and once again, he managed to slip away. Only then did they break the news to his mother that her son was wanted for the murder of 9 women, as well as up to 70 violent attacks and robberies in the city. With Duan now identified as the killer, the Yueyang task force wasted no time. They issued a national wanted bulletin with his photo and a physical description. Short, pale, slightly overweight, with small eyes, a square face, and a surgical scar on the left side of his abdomen. They learnt that he spent most of his nights staying in motels and guest houses, using fake IDs to remain hidden and anonymous. So they also provided a list of potential aliases, which included the name Hu Cheng. Officers chased leads across the province, but they always seemed one step behind, and every day that passed without his arrest, public fear kept growing. In such a small city, 9 murders was unthinkable. The killer became something of a legend, a dark figure locals whispered about. Some even stopped referring to him as the Red Dress Killer and began using his childhood nickname, Master Duan. For a while, it was common for police officers to greet each other by asking, "Has Master Duan been caught yet?" But despite their best efforts, it seemed like Duan had simply vanished. There was no sign of him anywhere in Yueyang, and though they didn't know it yet, that was because he'd already left the city. But Duan was no longer able to control himself. Despite his face being all over the news now, it wouldn't be long before he resumed his murderous rampage somewhere new. But before we get to that, now that we know the identity of the Red Dress Killer, I think it's time we take a look at exactly who he was and how he ended up becoming one of China's most notorious serial killers. And you know what that means. It's time to go all the way back to the start. Before the women in red, before the late-night ambushes, before the city of Yueyang even knew his name. Duan Guocheng was born in 1975. His family's ancestral home was in Jianli County in the Hubei province. But shortly after his birth, they relocated to the city of Yueyang in Hunan, where his father had found work. On the surface, his parents seemed ordinary. They had no criminal records. Their neighbors even described them as quiet, decent people. But behind closed doors, their home life was anything but calm. His parents fought constantly. Small disagreements exploded into shouting matches, and those fights often turned physical. Over time, the atmosphere grew so toxic that the family eventually stopped sharing meals at the same table. They lived like strangers, and that environment left its mark. From a young age, Duan was quiet, withdrawn, and cold. He didn't show much emotion. He didn't make any friends. But he did start stealing. At first it was just little things, a toy, a coin, a pocket knife. But when he was caught, his father responded with brutality. On one occasion, he used a pair of pliers to crush one of Duan's fingers as a punishment, permanently deforming it. But the punishment didn't work. It didn't scare Duan straight. If anything, it made him worse. By age 13, he'd already been given the nickname Master Duan by the other kids in his neighborhood. While this might sound like a respectful title, it was unquestionably intended to mock him, though I won't pretend to fully understand the cultural nuances behind the nickname. That same year, while still in elementary school, he was arrested for theft and sentenced to a juvenile detention center, where he'd experienced what was known at the time as reform through labor. His sentence was supposed to last 3 years, but instead of reforming behind bars, he rebelled. He broke rules, fought with guards, and showed no sign of remorse. And as a result, his sentence was extended by another 2 years. By the time Duan was released, he was 20 years old. He had spent the entirety of his teenage years behind bars, isolated, institutionalized, and angry. Within months of his release, he was arrested again for robbery. The court handed him another 5-year sentence, and by the time all was said and done, Duan had essentially been confined for half his life. Having been first imprisoned at age 13, when he finally got out, he was 25, and he was barely capable of functioning in society. His father, Duan Songqing, worked as a trash collector. He pulled every string he could to help his son, arranging for him to take a job at the Xinjiang Industrial Company. It didn't pay much, just a few hundred yuan a month, but it was something. And for a while things almost seemed stable, for the first time in his life. Duan wore neatly pressed clothes. He even shaved regularly. His father hoped he'd turned a corner. He even tried setting Duan up on a few blind dates, but the women wanted nothing to do with him. Word of his past spread quickly. And even when he fell for a girl at work, someone he liked enough to build up the courage to confess his feelings to, she rejected him. That moment shattered something inside him. From then on, he believed all women were cruel, that no woman was worth loving. And with that belief, his anger turned to hatred, and that hatred festered. He began drinking heavily, visiting prostitutes, gambling away what little money he had. He told reporters later that he never had any real friends, just people from prison who'd helped him forge documents, like the fake IDs he would later use. Duan felt cheated by life, and he blamed the world for his failures. By 1998, he felt like he had nothing, so he returned to his old ways and started stealing again. But this time, he focused his attention on women, the object of his hatred. He started mugging women at night all across Yueyang, and at first he claimed he didn't want to hurt anyone, he just wanted money. But on June 2nd, he spotted Xiao Chen as she was walking home around 11 p.m. He thought she was pretty, so he decided he was going to approach her and steal her belongings. But when he pointed his knife at her, she screamed, and this triggered something inside of him. So he dragged her into the alley and assaulted her. And when she kept screaming, he lost control of himself and stabbed her with his knife. And the more he stabbed her, the bigger the rush it gave him. He felt powerful, in control for the first time. A thrill he could never explain, and that he would come to find irresistible. After this first accidental murder, Duan maintained a relatively low profile. It's not totally clear what he did during this time period, but by April the next year, he'd quit his job at Xinjiang Industrial, and he was drifting aimlessly through life. He was broke, angry, and invisible to the world, and once again, he turned to robbery. But something had changed. He no longer just wanted money. He wanted that feeling again. The thrill, the control, the rage. And so, one night that spring, he waited outside the General Trade Union building in central Yueyang and watched a woman approach. Her name was Yan Sanying, and this time he wouldn't stop at robbery. He wouldn't stop at all. To keep moving and avoid detection, he began checking into cheap motels under fake names. He used a forged ID card under the name Hu Cheng, which had been made for him by an old contact from prison. In China, all guests checking into hotels are required to present government-issued identification. Without a valid ID, there was no place to stay. But with that forged card, Duan could go anywhere. Blend in, vanish, move on. He became a ghost drifting through Yueyang, changing guest houses, sticking to back alleys, sleeping through the day, and hunting by night. After slipping through the fingers of the police in Yueyang, it seemed like Duan had vanished without a trace. But in reality, he'd just changed locations. In the final days of March 2001, he boarded a long-distance bus out of the city, using his fake ID. His destination was Wuhan, one of the most populous cities in central China, and a place where a man like Duan could vanish into the crowd. Initially, he stayed with a relative for a few nights in Jianli County, his family's ancestral hometown in Hubei province. With no idea what he'd done, they happily let him crash with them and even lent him 300 yuan before he left. He arrived in Wuhan just before April with nothing but the borrowed money and a single change of clothes. But that was enough. Duan had lived like a ghost for years. He knew how to survive with nothing. He settled in the Wuchang district, where the high population of migrant workers made it easy to disappear. He checked into cheap guest houses near the train station using his forged identity card, bearing the name Hu Cheng. He switched motels regularly, drifting between cheap inns, keeping to back streets, never attracting attention. He spent time familiarizing himself with the area, and then he started killing again. On the night of May 7, 2001, a 24-year-old female university student was walking home to her dormitory in Huazhong village, near building number 47, shortly after midnight. But she never made it inside, because Duan ambushed her, stabbing her repeatedly with a large fruit knife and robbing her handbag, stealing her keys, an internet access card, and other belongings. After she was dead, he molested her body. It was the first confirmed attack in Wuhan, but it wouldn't be the last. Police in Wuhan had been given a directive that all homicide cases must be solved, so they quickly labelled the case the 5-7 homicide and formed a 40-person task force led by Wuchang's police chief. They canvassed local residents, both permanent and temporary, but uncovered nothing. Duan had no local ties, and his fake ID kept him hidden. 2 nights later, on May 9th, he struck again. This time, his victim was a woman in her early 30s walking down a small alley just off Liangdao Street at around 1:30 in the morning. Duan followed her into the courtyard of her apartment building, where he grabbed her by the neck, pressed a knife to her waist, and warned her to stay quiet. She complied, handing over more than 2,000 yuan in cash before he snatched her necklace off her. After telling him it was fake, he took out a lighter to test it, a trick he'd picked up during his years as a petty thief. He then demanded sex from her. But the woman began talking, stalling, probing his behavior, trying to keep him calm. And it may have actually saved her life. Because by the time Duan had finally lost his patience and dragged her into a stairwell to kill her, 2 passerbys had appeared. As he swung down at her with his knife, she used her hand to block the blade, causing her palm to rip open. As she screamed, the passerbys rushed to help her, causing Duan to flee, leaving her shaken, but alive. Despite the growing police presence on the streets, Duan felt untouchable. Nobody here knew his face. Nobody seemed to have any idea who he was. He barely had to make an effort to hide. And there was a reason for that. While the warning bulletin from Yueyang with details of his name, appearance, aliases and crimes had been received in Wuhan, it had been completely ignored. Nobody had connected the attacks to his previous crimes. Nobody had even looked at the information. And he likely knew this, because Chinese police departments were notoriously insular, rarely coordinating or paying any attention to anything going on outside of their jurisdictions. Feeling bolder than ever, on May 25th, he attacked another woman on the exact same street. This time, he slashed her with his knife and stole 500 yuan, but he didn't kill her. His next murder occurred less than a week later, on June 1st. Just after midnight, a 41-year-old woman called Wang was walking alone near Xiang Street, heading back home from her weekly game of mahjong. Just to point out, several of the victims were said to have been walking home after playing mahjong when they were attacked. I think this is the third I've already mentioned. It might just be that the game is that popular in China, but this could also indicate some of these accounts are mixed up in the reports and using the wrong information. When she reached the metal gate to her apartment block, Duan struck her from behind with a brick. As she stumbled and screamed, he spun her around and plunged his knife into her chest 7 times. As lights came on in the other apartments, he fled the scene, leaving her to bleed out on the street. And by the time any of her neighbours arrived to try and help, she was already dead. The very next night, he encountered a young female migrant worker in Hanshangguan. She was returning home at around 3 a.m. from a night market where she washed dishes. When Duan attacked her on the stairwell to her apartment building, she fiercely resisted him. So he responded with a frenzy of violence, stabbing her more than 30 times and killing her. And then on June 3rd, he struck again, making it the 3rd night in a row that he'd murdered someone. The victim was a young woman in her 20s, staying at a government dormitory. Duan attacked her outside the building, robbing her, molesting her body, and stabbing her over 20 times. It was a killing spree unlike anything Wuhan had ever seen, and people were beginning to notice. Likely started by those who'd heard of the similar cases in Yueyang through family, friends, or migrants, a rumor began to spread that a serial killer, the red dress killer, was stalking the streets of Wuhan and killing young women at night who were wearing red. Interestingly, despite the red dress theory being widely believed in both Yueyang and Wuhan, it doesn't appear that it was ever true. According to police, most of the victims were not wearing red and had little to no similarities. They also weren't all young and didn't all have long hair, like the rumours claimed. If anything, it's perhaps more of a reflection on how little information the public was being given about the situation, causing them to fill in the gaps, allowing rumours like these to spread so easily. Families in the Wuchang district began forbidding their daughters from going out at night. Some women even stopped wearing red or cut their hair short, just in case the rumours were true. By the end of June, Wuhan's Public Security Bureau had finally acknowledged what many already knew. A serial killer was stalking the city. They formed a special task force to investigate, and it grew quickly. Within weeks, more than 1,000 officers were working the case. Vacations were cancelled. Overtime was mandatory. Young female detectives were ordered to walk the streets alone at night, used as bait in hopes of drawing the killer out. One 27-year-old officer later recalled her time patrolling a narrow alley near Xiang Road. She was unarmed and made to wear a skirt, walking alone from midnight to 4 a.m., straining to hear every noise in the dark. And despite all of this, no connection to Duan and the Yueyang cases was made. Thanks to communication failures between regions, authorities in Wuhan had no idea the same man they were now hunting had already left a trail of blood in another city. There were no shared bulletins, no case comparisons, nothing. It didn't help that local journalists covering the case were muzzled. Stories were pulled, reports were spiked. The few articles that were published were circulated only among government officials, not the general public. The reasoning was to prevent panic, but in doing so, the government cut off vital information. Witnesses never came forward. Many victims didn't even realize they were in danger until it was too late. The husband of the woman murdered on June 1st later stated, "If we'd known there was a killer around, we would have been more careful. But nobody told us." On July 13th, Duan attempted to attack a woman and her child outside their house in Wuchang just after midnight. Luckily, just as he pulled out his knife, her husband appeared, causing him to run off into the darkness. She immediately contacted the police, and her description combined with the accounts of various other survivors helped authorities to piece together a composite image of Duan. In early August, 3 months after the killings had begun in Wuhan, the city's police finally had a sketch of their suspect and sent bulletins to the surrounding cities. They'd also come to believe that their killer was using the alias Hu Cheng, so they included the name in the bulletins. The second the alert came into the Yueyang Police Department, they immediately got on the phone to Wuchang. Not only did they recognize the sketch as Duan, but the crimes and murders were identical to the cases in their city, and the suspect was using the name Hu Cheng, one of Duan's known fake identities. They told the Wuchang police that the man they were looking for was Duan Guocheng, and they'd already told them months ago that he had murdered 9 people in their city. With the police departments in Yueyang and Wuchang finally realizing they're dealing with the same killer, they now had a confirmed total of 13 murders in roughly 2 years for Duan. Members of the task force hurried over to Wuchang and helped to compile a full profile of Duan. Together, they began distributing flyers with all the information they had around the various motels and hostels across the district, given they knew he had stayed in these sorts of places throughout his murder spree in Yueyang. To their surprise, it only took 10 minutes for someone to call them. A cashier at the 719 guest house, Yu Min, rang the number on their flyer and told them that there was a guest matching their description, staying in room 311 of her establishment at that very moment. And he just so happened to be registered under the name Hu Cheng. Already in the area distributing flyers, it took less than 5 minutes for Director Fang Yinsheng and 8 other officers to arrive at the guest house. According to some accounts, Duan was already trying to escape through the bathroom window when they stormed room 311. Others claim he was fast asleep on the bed. Either way, he didn't get far. It took 3 officers to pin him down and cuff him, but he was finally arrested and taken into custody. Under the bed, they found a blood-stained fruit knife. And in a drawer, they discovered multiple women's purses and other stolen items that would later be confirmed to belong to victims of the red dress killer. They even found shoes that perfectly matched footprints they had lifted from the 4 Wuchang murder scenes. When they sat Duan down, they expected him to deny everything. But to their surprise, he confessed immediately. Over the next several hours, he laid out his crimes in chilling detail for the detectives, admitting to dozens of robberies and assaults, including all 13 of the murders. He even told them about his first ever murder back in 1998. When asked why he stabbed his victims so many times, his answer was simple. he told them that when women screamed, it made him feel a rush, an unexplainable, uncontrollable urge that he had come to desperately crave. After conducting psychiatric evaluations, reports claim no signs of mental illness were discovered, with the psychiatrists all declaring that he was fully mentally sane and fully aware of what he was doing. He was transferred to the Wuhan No. 2 detention center, where he was formally charged. Few details exist about his trial, but it appears that it began around December 2001 and ended in February 2002, with him being sentenced to death. His mother attempted to visit him before his execution, delivering clothes to him in prison. But she wasn't allowed to see him. The only contact she received was a slip of paper signed by Duan to say he'd gotten the clothes. Though the exact date of his execution is unknown, justice moves quickly in China. So he was likely killed by a firing squad in the days or weeks after his trial ended. With the arrest and execution of Duan, the news blackout was finally lifted, and Wuhan's front pages declared that the psycho killer had been caught. Provincial leaders praised the officers involved in the case, with the detectives from the Wuchang branch receiving commendations and a 100,000 yuan bonus. Yumin was also given a 200,000 reward for placing the tip that led to Duan's arrest. The red dress killer was finally off the streets, but for the families of the women who were killed, and for those who narrowly escaped with their lives, no celebration could bring back what had been lost. For the survivors, the scars ran deeper than anyone could see. For the families, there were no answers that could ever make sense of it. And for the rest of the country, those who'd followed the case in silence, or only learned about it once it was over, the name Duan Guocheng would linger as a reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. It didn't take long for his name to disappear from the headlines. But the fear he left behind, that took much longer to fade. And with that, our deep dive into the case of the red dress killer comes to a close. As always, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe and do all those sorts of things that help the algorithm gods decide whether it's worthy or not. As I said up front, most of the information used to write this script has come from Chinese sources, so there are definitely some gaps in my timeline, and more than likely some mistakes in some of the details, but I've tried my best to be as accurate as possible with the information I was able to find. If you enjoy my channel and want to support my work further, there's a membership option here on YouTube, and a Patreon linked down below as well. But just know, the act of watching my videos is more than enough support, and I'm so grateful for every single one of you who tunes in to watch my stuff. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. September 16th, 1995. A man walks along a narrow path through a field near the Van Dyke mine in Boksburg, South Africa. Hunting for rabbits, he moves slowly, calmly. But then a foul smell suddenly hits his nostrils, catching him off guard. It's thick, sour, and unmistakable. The smell of death and decay. Figuring it's coming from a dead animal, he steps off the path and changes direction to avoid whatever's causing it. But after only a few steps, the stench seems to get worse. Much worse. And that's when he sees her. A woman is lying on the ground in front of him. Her wrists are bound. A gag is tied across her mouth, and there's no doubt that she's dead. He stops cold, his heart pounding in his chest as he tries to comprehend the gruesome scene before him. And then as he looks up from her body, he realizes something horrible. She isn't alone, because just a few meters away from her is another body, and another, and another. All women. All left here to rot under the harsh South African sun. Immediately contacting the authorities, by the time police finish combing through the field, they've recovered 10 bodies in varying stages of decomposition. Some are partially buried, others are left exposed out in the open, but all of them bear the hallmarks of the same killer. Wrists bound with clothing, faces partially covered, throats bruised from strangulation, This isn't just a crime scene, it's the dumping ground of a serial killer. And not just any serial killer, one of the worst and most prolific in the history of South Africa. A man who would later be convicted of 38 murders, but claims his own total to be as high as 76. And who would later draw comparisons to another notorious serial killer, often being labelled the Ted Bundy of South Africa. Not for the gore, but for the mask. The practiced charm and borrowed respectability that lowered his victims' defences, just long enough for him to make his move, and for them to disappear. Because this killer doesn't look like a monster. He smiles wide and warmly, he's polite, charismatic, and he comes offering job opportunities, hiding behind a wholesome-sounding charity to make his offers feel safe. With victims across 3 locations in South Africa, Atteridgeville, Boksburg and Cleveland, he earns a new name in the press, long before anyone knows who he truly is. This is the story of the ABC Killer. A year before the discovery at the Van Dyke mine, the Cleveland area of Johannesburg had a problem the police couldn't ignore. In early September 1994, 3 women were found dead within days. One near the Jupiter train station at Heriotdale, another beside the M2 freeway, and a third near a mine dump. All of the victims were black, and all of them had been neatly dressed when they were last seen. They were found partially undressed, having been assaulted and strangled with items of their own clothing. No identification was found on or near any of their bodies. Brixton murder and robbery took control of the cases, and it wasn't long before they connected them to 2 more bodies that had been found in the same area back in July. Then, on September 19th, another body turned up near a Heriotdale mine dump. With 6 victims murdered in an almost identical manner, police locked the district down for a full-scale search, which included nearly 150 officers, alongside tracking dogs, and even a helicopter. This led to the discovery of numerous items of women's underwear, alongside 2 additional bodies, both in advanced states of decomposition, which meant they now had at least 8 murdered women, all killed in the same manner, in an area with a radius of less than 3 miles. Identifications came slowly. One early victim, an 18-year-old schoolgirl called Marina Manama, had messages scrawled on her thighs, angry, clumsy lines that didn't seem to make any sense to the investigators. By the end of September, police psychologist Dr. Mickey Pistorius, the country's first criminal profiler, was brought in to help develop a profile for their suspect. She found that each victim seemed to follow the same pattern. They were lured to an industrial area, assaulted, and then strangled with their own clothing, including belts, pantyhose, and bras. Pistorius believed the killer was likely a black man in his mid-20s to early 30s. She claimed he would be neat, charming, and most likely projecting his status with smart clothes and a car. Because a couple of the bodies had been found in the exact same area, she asked for surveillance there, hoping he might return. But even with how bold he seemed to be, she thought it was unlikely, given the heavy press coverage the case was receiving. On October 8th, another victim was found near Geldenhuis station with the same hallmarks. Detectives then pulled 2 earlier cases of women found in fields near the same station that also matched the killer's MO. And after it turned out several of the victims had actually vanished from Pretoria West, nearly 50 miles away, another 2 cases in that area were discovered to perfectly match the killer's pattern and methods too. Within days, a press conference was held, in which Brixton's police commander offered a public reward of 200,000 rand for information. As the identifications continued, a pattern of approach started to show. In Pretoria, a man offered a young fashion student a job on Church Square. She arranged to meet him the next day, but never came home. She was one of the first victims found in September, near the M2. In another case, a toll booth cashier vanished. 3 days later, someone calling himself Martin phoned her employer, claiming she'd been in an accident, and asked that her salary be paid into her account. After a different woman was killed in Pretoria West, a caller used the name Moses Sima when he phoned her employer, claiming he'd found her ID book. It seemed several of the victims had last been seen with a well-dressed man promising work, presumably the same man who had been making these phone calls. Using these witnesses, the detectives built an identikit, which helped garner a number of leads that pointed them to a suspect, David Selepe. David lived in Boksburg, but he had links to both Pretoria West and Cleveland, where most of the victims had been found. This included an office he rented in Pretoria for a small business called Vision English Girls College, which just so happened to target the same sorts of young women that were turning up dead. He was a perfect match for the man described both by witnesses and Pistorius's profile. He dressed flash and drove a Mercedes registered in a woman's name. One woman even told the detectives that he'd offered her a job before trying to assault her. Before they could apprehend him, they discovered that he'd quietly slipped out of the country for business. After putting an alert out, his Mercedes was stopped in Maputo by Mozambican police on December 15th. In the boot of his car, they found newspaper clippings about the Cleveland murders, as well as scuff marks that suggested someone had been shut inside it recently. So David was brought back to Johannesburg and held at Brixton, where detectives claimed he confessed to 15 murders. Though this was only done verbally, with no signed confession and no video or audio recording. They claimed he told them that he didn't act alone, citing two men he called Tito and Mandler as his accomplices. Though he refused to sign a formal confession, he agreed to point out crime scenes to them. That weekend, he led detectives to various sites in handcuffs and leg irons. At Geldenhuis, he indicated the place where one of the victims, Amanda Theth, had been found, telling them there was a plastic bag under a thicket with her clothing in it. They removed his leg irons so he could walk over the rough terrain, and then removed his cuffs so he could reach into the brush to locate the bag. But instead, David seized his chance and snatched a thick branch, cracking it across the detective's back. As he tried to run for it, one of the officers shouted a warning and fired. The shot hit David in the head, and he died in hospital later that day. The backlash from the press was immediate. They had no recorded or written confession of any kind, and they just killed their suspect. Headlines questioned why 3 officers could not subdue a man with a branch, and why he was shot in the head, not somewhere less fatal. But the shooting was ultimately ruled as self-defense by an inquest. And despite never sharing it with anyone, the police publicly announced that forensic evidence tied David to at least 6 of the murders in Cleveland. However, even though the man the police said was their serial killer was now dead, the bodies didn't stop turning up. In early January 1995, a new body surfaced in Atteridgeville, just outside Pretoria. Her remains were badly decomposed, and she'd been assaulted, partially undressed, bound, and strangled with her own clothing, just like all of David's victims. Except, David was dead when she was murdered, likely a week or so prior to her discovery. Initially, police dismissed the crime as the work of a copycat killer. But as autumn turned to winter, body after body was found, bearing the exact same hallmarks as all the earlier murders. And by June, there were at least 8 new victims discovered around Pretoria West and Atteridgeville. The killings should have ended with David's death, but they didn't. If anything, they intensified. On February 9th, another woman was found in Atteridgeville. She was later identified via her fingerprints as 27-year-old Beauty Nuku Soko. She'd gone missing in January on her way to see her sister. March brought more. Construction workers digging a trench in Atteridgeville uncovered a woman's chest protruding from the soil. She was identified as 25-year-old Sarah Matlakal Makono. According to her family, she'd left 3 days before she was found to meet a man who'd promised her a job. On April 12th, the body of Letta Nomthandazo and Langa Mandla was found in the same area. Her hands were tied behind her back using her own bra, and she'd been strangled and stripped. Most of her clothing was found scattered around her body, but her underwear was missing. The next day, searchers found a small body about 20 meters from where Letta had been discovered. It was her 2-year-old son, Sibusiso. Letta had taken him along with her to a job meeting. It was believed the killer struck the child, leaving him to succumb to the cold and dark beside his mother's body. If David hadn't been caught and killed, there would have been no question that the same killer was responsible for these Atteridgeville cases. So this raised some massive and uneasy questions for the investigators. Was this new killer one of the accomplices David had mentioned? Or did they have the wrong man with David, allowing the true killer to continue hunting in a new area? In mid-May, 29-year-old Esther Moshibudi Manetja was found in a field in Pretoria West. Like the other victims, she'd been strangled with her own clothing, and her lower body was exposed. And this pattern repeated again and again. In June, a woman was found against a tree with a garrote twisted from her underwear and handbag strap. Then another body was found, and another one. A 4th June victim was discovered in Atteridgeville with her pantyhose tied so tightly around her neck with a stick that bone fragments were embedded in the fabric. And then the killer crossed over to Boksburg. The first case in the area occurred on July 17th, when a man living near Byers Park witnessed a man and a woman walk off into a field together, with only the man returning. When he went to investigate, he found the woman on the ground, still warm. With police arriving at the scene, they tried to revive her, but it was too late. She was 25-year-old Josephine Mansali Malangeni, a mother of 4 who'd gone to meet someone about a job. Unfortunately, the witness had been too far away to offer any useful descriptions of the man he'd seen. Within days, 2 more bodies were found in the area, both showing the same hallmarks. With the help of Mickey Pistorius again, Pretoria's murder and robbery unit set up a dedicated task force to try and catch the killer responsible. And as they pinned the crime scene photos to the wall in date order, a pattern snapped into focus. Early cases showed signs of manual throttling, then ligatures, bras, pantyhose, belts. And then in some newer cases, the fabric had been twisted tight like a tourniquet for leverage and control. Faces were often covered, hands moved from unbound to tied in front to tied behind the back. Whoever this was, he wasn't improvising anymore. He was practicing, perfecting his method. And the lure repeated too. Families kept saying the same thing. She'd left for a meeting, or an interview, or a job opportunity, and never came back. It was exactly what the families had told them when they were investigating the initial Cleveland murders attributed to David Selepe. 5 more victims were discovered in August, with several now back in the Cleveland area where it seemed everything had once started. The geography was a triangle the newspapers would soon name for them. A for Atteridgeville, B for Boxburg, C for Cleveland. The ABC pattern wasn't a headline yet, but the detectives could see it forming on their wall. The unidentified killer even began making taunting calls to relatives of the victims. In one widely repeated account, a woman's grandmother was told she'd unknowingly walked over her granddaughter's shallow grave by a man calling himself Mandler. And then on September 16th, a man out hunting rabbits walked into a field at the Van Dyke mine and found a woman's body. Then another, and another, leading the police to recover 10 more victims in the field. By nightfall, the field at the Van Dyke mine was a grid of tape and flags. More than 30 officers and forensic techs moved square by square, photographing, bagging, and logging everything. Heat and insects had chewed up a lot of the scene, so they focused on what might still hold value. Makeshift ligatures and gags, clothing, jewelry, soil and plant samples, any shoe impressions. Wherever they could, they took swabs for DNA. When Mickey Pistorius arrived, she found it to be one of the worst crime scenes she'd ever seen. The bodies were scattered across the field, clustered within a few hundred meters of one another. Some of them had been there for months. Others were way more recent, which suggested that the killer had returned to the site again and again, leaving each new victim close to the last. It also looked like a few of them had been killed right there, which meant the killer had marched some of the women into his graveyard and shown them the other victims before he strangled them. To Pistorius, it seemed clear that the killer had made almost no effort to conceal the bodies, which to her read as confidence. These weren't the victims of panic or impulse. They were the victims of routine, somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. And that routine didn't start here. The bindings, the face coverings, the ligatures made from clothing, it all matched the pattern the detectives had been chasing all year across Atteridgeville, Boxburg, and Cleveland. Their serial killer had just given them 10 more bodies all at once. The lab had DNA samples from multiple victims, enough to see the same unknown male profile popping up again and again. But what they didn't have was a name to match it to. In fact, they didn't even have a single suspect yet. Pressure spiked as the story jumped from local to national news. Patrols were increased around open fields, and detectives worked in shifts at the operations room, pushing every small lead. To try and help solve the case, Pistorius reached out to retired FBI agent Robert Ressler, having previously met him at a conference. If you don't know who he is, I talk about Ressler a lot on this channel, because he comes up a lot in serial killer cases, alongside his fellow FBI profiler John Douglas. Ressler and Douglas were some of the first criminal profilers, and were instrumental in helping catch countless serial killers over the years. When he arrived in South Africa, Ressler visited the key dump sites, studied crime scene photographs, and reviewed autopsy reports. This helped him build an initial profile of the suspect, who he described as intelligent, organized, and sexually driven. He also believed the killer was growing in confidence, making him more dangerous with every crime he committed. He was convinced that the crimes pointed to a single, evolving killer, rather than a partnership as the detectives had feared. His victim selection also seemed consistent. he targeted predominantly women in their 20s or early 30s who were well-dressed and often unemployed or between jobs. Many of them were actively seeking work, perhaps making it easy for him to lure them to isolated locations with the promise of employment. Ressler believed the killer likely bore a personal grudge against a specific woman, rooted in his past, and that he was replaying his act of revenge with each of his victims, a theory that would later prove to be unnervingly accurate. Ressler's profile was remarkably similar to that of the Cleveland serial killer, which again raised concerns, given the overlapping crime scenes and similar murders, that David Selepe was not actually responsible for those murders. So the National Commissioner of the Police asked Ressler and Pistorius to examine the case against David. Ultimately, they concluded that David was likely involved in the Cleveland killings, and that this was an entirely new killer that they were hunting. A killer who was growing bolder and more arrogant by the day. The only real clue the task force had was the job interview lure families kept mentioning. Over and over, the accounts were the same. The women had been on their way to job interviews when they vanished. Most of these supposed positions were vague, the details sketchy at best. No one could say for certain who the employer was, or where these interviews were supposed to be held. At least that was the case, until the murder of Amelia Rapidil. Because among her belongings, detectives found an application form for an organization called Youth Against Human Abuse. According to her family, a man from the group had offered her a position and had arranged to meet her on the very day she disappeared. And this time, he had a name. Moses Sithole. The phone number on the form led officers to Wattville, where they met a woman called Kwasi Sithole, Moses' sister. But she told them she hadn't seen her brother for a long time and didn't know where he was. Then came another confirmation. One of the women found in the Van Dyke minefield was identified as 31-year-old Tryphena Magotsi, who'd worked at a children's care home in Benoni. Her colleagues told police that just before her disappearance, a man calling himself Moses Sithole from the charity Youth Against Human Abuse had come to the care home, offering employment opportunities. So when Tryphena didn't show up for work the next day, her colleagues assumed she'd accepted his offer. It wasn't until her mother arrived a few days later in a frantic state that any of them realized something was wrong. When they ran the name in their system, there were a lot of matches, as it was a fairly common name. But there was one specific Moses Sithole who had a prior sexual assault conviction against him. So they printed out his mugshot and showed it to Tryphena's co-workers. Without hesitation, they told them he was the man who'd come to their workplace. And so within 24 hours, Moses Sithole's face was on front pages all across South Africa. The ABC killer was no longer a phantom. He was a truck washer, a self-styled youth counsellor, and now a fugitive. By the time police were able to track down where he was living, Moses was already gone. He'd seen his face on the news and knew it wouldn't be long before they came for him. But despite the extensive press coverage and his identity being revealed to the nation, he didn't stop killing. Only a week after the Van Dyke discovery, the body of 21-year-old Agnes Mbuli was found near a railway stop outside Benoni. And that very same day, a man called the newsroom of the Star paper and asked to speak to reporter Tamsin de Beer. When she answered the phone, he told her that he was the ABC killer everyone was looking for, and he wanted to confess what he'd done. Before we continue with what happened next, now that we know who the killer is, it's time that we go back to the start and find out how we actually got to this point. Moses Sithole was born on November 17, 1964, in a small town just outside of Johannesburg. He was the fourth of 5 children, raised by Simon and Sophie Sithole, a black family struggling through the oppressive years of apartheid in South Africa. Life became even harder for them when Simon died. Because with no steady income, Sophie struggled to feed and clothe her children, and her sadness soon turned into a growing dependence on alcohol. And before long, she began physically abusing her children. Eventually, she made a desperate decision. She took all 5 of them to a police station, told them not to reveal that she was their mother, and left them there. So they were all sent to live at an orphanage. For 3 years, Moses claims he and his siblings endured physical mistreatment from the people who were supposed to care for them at the orphanage. Things got so bad that he felt he had no choice but to make an escape. Fleeing the orphanage, he ran straight to his mother, but she refused to take him in. Instead, she delivered him right back to the orphanage he told her was abusing him. As you can imagine, being rejected for a second time by the one person who should have protected him and loved him unconditionally left deep emotional scars. After being transferred to another children's home, Moses escaped again. This time, he hitchhiked his way to Gauteng to stay with his older brother, Patrick. With Patrick barely able to support himself, Moses took on whatever work he could get to survive, including working in dangerous gold mines. Outwardly, he seemed polite, intelligent, and friendly. His good looks and warm smile garnered attention from young women, and he was even known to help street children, perhaps seeing a reflection of his own childhood in them. But beneath the surface, resentment was festering, particularly towards women, presumably influenced by the way he'd been abused, abandoned, and rejected, both by his mother and his carers at the orphanages. And then, in 1987, at the age of 22, Moses finally let his rage pour out and attacked his girlfriend's sister, Patricia, near an abandoned mine. But Patricia never reported the assault to the police, too afraid of the consequences after he threatened her. And this lack of accountability encouraged Moses to do it again, and then again, and again. And every time, his victims remained silent, believing his threats that he'd kill them if they told anybody. By his mid-20s, he'd refined a tactic that would later become his hallmark, posing as a businessman offering employment. One target, a woman called Doris Swakamisa, met him at Germiston train station for a supposed interview. Moses led her along a shortcut through a field before he pulled out a machete. He then bound her hands with her own underwear and assaulted her. But unlike the later crimes this attack foreshadowed, he didn't kill her. And in this instance, Doris did not remain silent. She reported what had happened to the police, but she didn't even know his real name, making it difficult for them to track him down. But fate intervened when she spotted him in a shop a couple of weeks later. Officers from the Cleveland Police Department arrested him, and while being transported to the station in the exact same car as Doris, he was heard saying to her, "Bitch, I should have killed you." Moses insisted that he was innocent, but the prosecution was able to gather enough evidence to prove otherwise. And in the end, he was sentenced to 7 years in Johannesburg's Boksburg prison. While he was incarcerated, both his mother and one of his sisters died, which only further fueled his anger, especially towards Doris, who he blamed for his imprisonment. If his hatred towards women had been overwhelming before, now it was all-consuming. In 1993, while still behind bars, Moses began corresponding with a woman called Martha Ndlovu after meeting while she was visiting a relative in the same prison. She was initially reluctant to talk to him, but his letters eventually persuaded her to meet up with him after his release. According to his own account, he endured severe abuse from his fellow inmates in prison. But upon his release after serving just 4 of his 7 years, he claimed he was determined to put it all behind him and start over. He blended quickly back into society. His good looks and charm made it easy for him to convince people he was a friendly, respectable man. He even managed to win over Martha's parents and convince her to let him move in with her. Her brother gave him work in the family's car repair shop, and by December 1994, his first daughter, Bridget, was born. But in reality, nothing had changed for Moses. The resentment, anger, and hatred that he'd felt since his childhood hadn't magically gone away. He'd just gotten better at hiding it, at creating a public mask of smiles and laughs. He told his new family that he was searching for a better career, which they fully supported. And under this guise, he regularly headed into town dressed in a suit and carrying a newspaper. What they didn't know was that inside the folded newspaper was a knife. It's generally thought that his first victim may have been 18-year-old Marina Manama in July 1994, who was one of the first bodies found in the Cleveland serial killer case. It's believed he lured her with the promise of employment, before he led her into a field, assaulted her, and killed her. And when he was done, he wrote the strange messages on her skin. Around the same time, he found work-washing delivery trucks at Afrox in the East Rand. Though it's unclear if his family was aware his hunt for a better job had led to an even more menial, labour-intensive one. He also created his Youth Against Human Abuse organization, a shell of a charity that gave him a reason to approach unemployed women looking for work. He used typed application forms, set up interviews, and made everything seem respectable and above board, just enough to deceive his victims and make them think his offers were real. He'd later be branded the Ted Bundy of South Africa, not because they killed the same way, but because both wore such a convincing mask, polite, helpful, unthreatening, and used it to get close to their victims. Both relied on charm rather than a weapon in the first moments. And while there are some direct parallels, such as Bundy manning a crisis hotline and Moses fronting a child protection charity, the label ultimately stuck because of the camouflage of smiles and charisma they both hid behind. Moses used a variety of aliases during this time, including Joseph, Martin, and Mandler, especially when making taunting calls to family members of his victims. And over the coming months, he openly discussed the murders and the ABC killer case with his neighbors, pretending to share in their fear and curiosity. In reality, he was fishing for information, trying to work out what people knew, specifically what the police knew, about his own crimes. Because if he is to be believed, in the span of roughly a year, he murdered more than 70 women. By late July 1995, tensions between him and Martha led to his abrupt departure. And only 2 months later, she discovered the horrifying truth: that the man she lived with, the man she loved, and who had fathered her daughter, was now the prime suspect in South Africa's worst ever serial killer case. When Moses called Tamsin de Beer at the Star, he gave his name as Joseph Magwena. And he didn't waste any time. In his first conversation with her, he told her he was ready to surrender, and then he calmly offered her details no newspaper had printed yet about the various murders. As soon as the call was over, she contacted the police. And over the following weeks in October, Joseph rang her another 3 times, with police recording and listening in to every conversation. Piece by piece, he sketched his own origin story for her. He told her that he'd been wrongfully convicted for sexually assaulting a woman years earlier. And while in prison for the crime he said he hadn't committed, he was beaten and abused by other inmates. He claimed that when he was finally released, he couldn't shake the overwhelming anger inside of him that the situation had fostered. He then told her that he began to lure women to quiet spots, where he'd bind them and then strangle them with their own clothing, typically using underwear because it didn't leave any fingerprints. He confessed that he was the one behind all of the murders in Pretoria, Attridgeville, and Boksburg, but adamantly denied being involved in any of the crimes in Cleveland. He even pointed out one specific case, the murder of Letta and her 2-year-old son, and told her that he was not the killer, stating that he loved children and would never harm them. Much of what he said matched what detectives already knew about him. Police currently had his victim count in the mid-30s, but according to Joseph, he'd already killed at least 76 women. Tamsin pushed for proof, so Joseph gave directions to a site no one had searched yet. And when officers went to check it out, they found skeletal remains exactly where he said they'd be. Days later, he pointed them to another victim, a woman hanging from a tree in an open field. There was no doubt that the voice on the line belonged to the killer, and he was still actively hunting for victims, because in the days that followed, 3 more bodies were discovered. During one of his calls to Tamsin, he ran out of money and asked her to call him back, giving her the number of the payphone he was using. Police raced to the location to catch him, but by the time they got there, the phone booth was already empty. It was the second mistake Moses had made in quick succession, and it wouldn't be long before he'd make the third and final mistake that would lead to his own downfall. Not long after his face hit the papers, Moses phoned his brother-in-law, Maxwell, and told him he needed a gun for protection. He suggested that they meet at the Mintex factory in Benoni where Maxwell worked, so he could give him the weapon. But what he didn't know was that his sister, Kwasi, had been speaking with detectives ever since her number turned up on his fake charity's paperwork. And as soon as she heard about the gun, she and Maxwell contacted the task force. Undercover officers took up quiet positions around the factory, and to their surprise, Moses arrived exactly when he said he would. But he clearly sensed something was amiss, because before he had the chance to meet up with Maxwell, he suddenly turned and bolted as fast as he could from the factory. Inspector Francis Mulavedzi, who was posing as a security guard, shouted for him to stop and even fired 2 warning shots. But Moses darted off into a dim alley, forcing him to give chase. As the inspector closed in on him, Moses suddenly wheeled around with a hatchet in his hands. As he charged the inspector, he shot him in the leg, trying to put him out of action. But Moses didn't stop. He barely missed him as he swung the hatchet at him again, and then he bit down hard on his hand, presumably hoping to make him drop his gun. But rather than dropping it, Inspector Mulavedzi fired twice more. The first shot missed Moses, but the second one hit him in the stomach, causing him to drop to the ground. Moses was rushed to hospital and into surgery, with fear that he was going to die before they could charge him with anything or have him properly confess, just like David had the previous December. If Moses did die, they would never get the answers they needed to understand how everything tied together. Moses was taken under guard to a military hospital where surgeons treated the gunshot wounds he'd sustained. He survived the procedure, but during his hospital stay, doctors discovered that he was HIV positive. News of his arrest spread quickly across South Africa, and while you might have expected there to be a sense of relief that his reign of terror was finally over, there wasn't. Only a year earlier, David Selepe had been arrested and killed in police custody for what many saw as murders that were clearly part of the exact same case. Yet the killings had continued, intensified even, after his death. So there was a prevalent belief that Moses, and even David, were perhaps just part of a larger network of predators, small cogs in a big, deadly machine, and that the killings might once again continue and get even worse now that he'd been arrested. Others just couldn't reconcile the polite, well-dressed man in the news photographs with the image of a ruthless murderer capable of killing so many women. Once he was well enough to be discharged from hospital, Moses was transferred directly into police custody, and his DNA was quickly matched to samples they had gathered from dozens of the ABC killer victims. As a result, within just 5 days of his arrest, he was brought before the Brakpan Magistrates Court to face charges in connection with 29 murders. He was then moved to Boksburg Prison, the same place he'd spent his earlier incarceration, to await his trial. In recorded statements to the police, Moses tried to explain away his actions, claiming that his experiences at the orphanages had shaped him into a sexual predator, and that the abuse he'd suffered in prison had then transformed him into a killer. He claimed that he targeted women who reminded him of Doris, the woman he was still adamant had falsely accused him of assaulting her. In his own words, "A woman can hurt you more than a man, more than anybody in this world." He admitted that his charity was just part of the false front that he used to disarm his victims. In his eyes, it allowed him to present himself as a married man working for a good cause, which helped cultivate an air of trustworthiness that made his victims less suspicious of him. When describing his first murder, he claimed it was of a woman who shouted at him when he asked for directions, though he couldn't recall her name. He told them coldly that afterwards he went home and showered and continued his normal day as if nothing had happened. Interestingly, he was very clear that he'd never worked with anyone else and had no connection to David Selepe, though he did suggest other killers had copied his methods. There was some debate over whether he was mentally fit to stand trial, with psychiatrist Dr. Leon Fine recommending that he undergo evaluation. He argued that injuries Moses had sustained throughout his life had impaired his ability to understand that what he was doing was wrong. Despite these claims, the prosecution highlighted how calculated Moses had been. He carefully lured women away from busy areas, left next to no physical evidence, and disposed of their belongings to make identifying them harder. After he was moved to Krugersdorp prison for assessment, doctors ultimately found no evidence of a brain injury or mental disorder that would affect his grasp of right and wrong, so he was declared fit to stand trial, and to face punishment for all the lives he had so callously taken. The trial of Moses Sithole began on October 21, 1996, and became one of the most drawn-out and expensive criminal cases in South African history. Lasting close to a year, it drew intense public attention and featured weeks of testimony covering the smallest forensic details, lengthy discussions about DNA analysis, and an endless string of witnesses on the stand. The headlines were explosive, especially after the prosecutors announced that Moses would be tried on 38 counts of murder, 40 counts of sexual assault, and 6 counts of robbery. And shockingly, there were 4 cases among the murder charges that had previously been attributed to David Selepe. The decision to include those 4 former Cleveland cases among Moses's charges raised difficult questions the police themselves never fully answered. David had been dead for almost 2 years now, shot at the scene where Amanda Theth's body had been found, which he was supposedly showing to the detectives. Yet in the case of Amanda, the evidence now pointed elsewhere. Moses had known her personally. He'd visited her house before she disappeared, and even met her family, who thought he was her boyfriend. He'd attended her funeral, and most damningly, he was captured on bank surveillance footage using her card after her death. His own sister identified him in the footage. Whatever connection David had to Amanda's crime scene, investigators now firmly believed her killer was Moses. Similarly, the case of Marina Manama was originally linked to David, but was now believed to be the first murder committed by Moses. Her body had strange messages written on it that nobody was ever able to truly make sense of. So could these messages have been left by one killer for another to see? There were other overlaps that blurred the lines between their crimes. A phone call was made to one of David's victims' employers under the name Martin, an alias that would later appear many times in Moses's own activities. Similar methods of luring victims with false job offers were used in both sets of murders. Even one of Moses's other aliases, Mandler, matched the name of one of the accomplices David once claimed to have had. Police had stated they were able to definitively confirm David's link to 6 of the Cleveland murders, but they never revealed which ones or whether the 4 later charged to Moses were among them. That silence left open the possibility, or in some minds, the certainty, that the 2 men's paths had crossed in ways still unknown. For his part, Moses denied ever meeting David. So all of this seemed to point to one of 2 things. Either Moses and David had worked together in some manner, or that David had been falsely accused, fed information by the police, and then been killed to stop it all being revealed. But even if the latter was the case, and everything David knew about the crimes was fed to him by the police, it seems a little bit more than coincidental that he would reference one of the exact nicknames used by Moses. So assuming the police were telling the truth, that they could definitively link David to several murders with hard evidence, then we're only really left with one explanation. Mickey Pistorius later suggested that if there'd been any contact between the 2 men, perhaps Moses's denial wasn't about hiding it, but about keeping the full weight of the infamy for himself. Moses clearly changed his story several times. What he said to Tamsin DeBeer of the Star, including his victim count of 76, was very different from what he confessed in the police videos, what he'd go on to say in court, and even what he admitted in a secretly filmed prison video. Every single confession contradicted the last. One thing he seemed to remain certain of through all of them, though, was that he'd never killed anybody in Cleveland. The majority of the murders still tied to David occurred in Cleveland, but so did many of the murders that happened long after his death. I highly doubt Moses was being truthful with this claim. But if we imagine for a second that he was, could this mean that alongside Moses and David, there was a 3rd killer operating who was never identified or caught? After all, if Moses truly was the Mandler that David mentioned, then who was the 2nd accomplice he called Tito? At his trial, Moses pled not guilty, and for most of the court proceedings, he appeared calm and detached. The only time he showed any real emotion was when Inspector Mulavedzi described shooting him during his arrest in what he called an act of self-defense. Moses's legal defenders countered this, insisting that the inspector had fired at him without provocation. Moses's wife Martha took the stand for the prosecution. She identified pieces of jewelry as belonging to her husband, which investigators then explained had been stolen from the bodies of various victims, presumably as trophies. At one point, Moses asked if he could hold his young daughter, but Martha refused his request. Several women who'd survived attacks and assaults by Moses before his initial 1989 imprisonment testified against him, describing how he'd lured, attacked, and threatened them. Their testimony was used to not only establish that many of these early crimes mirrored and foreshadowed the latter murders, but to highlight that the killings had started soon after his release from prison. The prosecution linked him directly to the 38 murders, using phone records, recovered personal items found in his possession, and conclusive DNA matches. A voice analyst even confirmed that the man who had called Tamsin DeBeer under the alias Joseph was actually Moses. The video recordings the police had made in which he confessed became a point of contention throughout the trial. His lawyers tried to argue that he'd been pressured into confessing, with detectives feeding him the names of victims and other details to repeat on tape. This caused the entire trial to come to a halt in late January, until the judge ultimately ruled in July that the confession video had not been coerced and could be used as evidence in court. In the tapes, Moses confessed to 29 of the murders and described in detail how he restrained, assaulted, and strangled his victims. However, he claimed any murder that involved bleeding or more graphic injury was not his doing, and claimed that he covered his victims' faces because he didn't want to see their final expressions when he killed them. He was even heard saying, "I regret not killing the lady who falsely accused me," in the segment of the video where he discussed targeting women who resembled Doris. It was revealed during the trial that Moses had persuaded Melody Stern, a typist at Afrox where he washed trucks, to produce application forms for his fake organization. At first, he called it the Child Protection Community Organization, before he renamed it Youth Against Human Abuse at her suggestion. Melody, like many others, believed Moses was genuine at the time, and she thought she was assisting him in his mission to help disadvantaged children. And there were plenty of other people like her. In one of the cases that led to his identification, the murder of Trifina Magotsi, he'd even managed to convince a freelance photographer to work for him, adding a sense of credibility to his appearance at the care home when he showed up, offering jobs with his charity. Many grieving friends and relatives told the same story to the court. Their loved one left home for what they thought was a job interview and vanished. When it came time for Moses to testify, he insisted he was innocent and that everything he said in his confession videos had been fed to him by the police. The only thing he acknowledged was that he knew Patricia, one of his assault victims prior to his initial arrest. But all he would admit was that she was the sister of his girlfriend at the time, not that he had attacked her. He even continued to deny he had assaulted Doris, claiming she'd lied to get him imprisoned back in 1989. His time on the witness stand was marked by long pauses, mumbling and rambling answers that were often difficult to follow. Unlike Ted Bundy, who famously courted media attention and treated his trial as a stage, Moses avoided theatrics, preferring to sit quietly in the dock, although sometimes he could be seen with a faint smile on his face. To many observers, it was the expression of a man who saw people not as human beings, but as objects to manipulate and destroy. On December 4, 1997, after a 3-hour reading, Justice David Curlewis found Moses Sithole guilty of every charge put against him, including all 38 murders. The next day, Moses returned to court to hear his sentence. He was given 50 years for each of the murders, 12 years for each of the assaults, and 5 years for each of the robberies, resulting in a consecutive sentence of 2,410 years in prison. He was actually granted eligibility for parole, as long as he could live long enough to serve his first 930 years behind bars. Justice Curlewis made it clear in his sentencing that had the death penalty still been in effect, he would have imposed it without hesitation. He even took the opportunity to take a few jabs at the prison authorities, stating that under no circumstance should Moses ever get out of prison. Moses showed no emotion as his sentence was read out. He was then moved to CMAX, the maximum security section of the Pretoria Central Prison, where South Africa's most dangerous and high-risk inmates were housed. Although Moses was initially estimated to only live for another 5 to 8 years after his HIV diagnosis, access to high-quality medical care in prison allowed his health to improve. And to this day, he remains behind bars, and still alive. His wife and child, on the other hand, who were also infected, could not afford treatment. Although it's unknown exactly what happened to them, it's widely believed that they both died from the disease they'd contracted from Moses. Now 60 years old, he is currently imprisoned at the Mangaung Correctional Centre in Bloemfontein. As far as I can tell, there has been no new revelations, confessions, or updates about the case in the almost 30 years since he was given his sentence. But to this day, there are still many questions around both Moses and David's role in the various murders. Were they two practically identical serial killers operating in the same area at the same time? Did they know each other and work together? Was there a third accomplice, as David had once claimed? Or was David just an unfortunate scapegoat for some of Moses' earliest murders? 12 of Moses' confirmed victims were never able to be identified and were ultimately buried in unmarked graves, their names forgotten, and their resting places untended by anyone. There are almost certainly many more who will never even be found. Because for every victim whose story was told in court, there were others whose names will never be spoken, whose families will never even know where to grieve. People often call Moses the South African Ted Bundy, but in reality, Bundy isn't even in the same league as this monster. Moses was a cold, calculated predator, and even though he'll spend the rest of his days locked up in a cell, it's still a far kinder fate than any of his victims received. And with that, our deep dive into the case of the ABC killer comes to a close. As always, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe and do all the things that help the algorithm gods know that it's worth showing it to other people. And if you want to support my channel further and have your name featured at the end of my videos, I've got a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked down below as well. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.